Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Swim Brief. The Swim Brief podcast is brought to you, I should say, well, maybe also bought, by Jersey Wahoo's Swim Club. For the third year in a row, a silver medal club in Mount Laurel, New Jersey. We're very proud of that, and we're working our way to try to get up to gold. Today is going to be a solo cast, and I wanted to follow up on a podcast I did a year ago and add some stuff, and also basically I'm trying to, if you look in YouTube and etc., I'm trying to do some more generalized swimming talk here on the podcast because I've gotten some really good feedback on it. If you want to check out the similar video I did a starts breakdown, a talk about why Caleb Dressel is so much better off the block than Michael Andrew, and look at some Olympic footage in that. That video is performing really well on YouTube, so keep the algorithm going. If you watch it and you like it, even if you don't like it, leave a comment. It's going to get more eyeballs on it, so I really appreciate everybody who is going to do that in the future. But today I want to talk about some of the most popular training modalities and basically what I see as some of the features. When I say this is a follow-up to a previous video, if you look back in my feed, I don't know the exact date, but I have another one of these solo cast videos where I talk about how I used to be a pretty strong U.S. RPT, ultra short race pace training adherent, ran a very strict U.S. RPT program, and now I would say I am coaching in a much higher volume style. And but I think part of what I want to do, and I'll get to this in a second, is redefine some of the terms that we use when we sort of argue or maybe just have a pleasant conversation about some of these different training modalities. So I'm going to do that in a second, but first I just sort of want to set up a few principles. I think one of the universals in training swimmers, which is what swim coaches do, right, is that we want to set up practice to create a training effect. And what is a training effect? Okay, the easiest way to explain this, and by the way, all credit to USRPT because I'm basically drawing my definition of training effect from the scientific papers of Brent Rushell. So definitely big ups to him. The idea is that you're going to come to practice, you're going to do some repetitive swimming, and you're going to do it to a level such that you put some stress on the body, and you want to put enough stress on so that it provokes your body, provokes adaptation in your body, right? So if you go in and you don't train hard enough, if you don't sort of push to your limit in a given practice, your body's going to think everything's fine just the way we are, nothing needs to change, and it will not make adaptations to make you better at swimming. Okay? Conversely, you could go into a training session and put so much stress on your body that all the signaling inside you goes, oh no, we're in an emergency situation, better start shutting things down so that we don't die. Okay, that's what creates over the long term an overtraining effect. If you keep pushing so hard that your body thinks that you're in mortal danger, it will make adaptations, but not the kind of adaptations you want for high performance. So right in the middle of those two things is a training effect. And so it's pretty basic, that anybody that is running a practice that is training people is trying to create a training effect. That's what we want. Now, of course, in all sports, we're talking about swimming specifically here, people are going to go about creating that training effect in all sorts of ways. And I am going to do some very generalized talking about sort of two ends of the spectrum in the sport of swimming. And this is where I'm going to get to redefining some of the terms the way we talk about it. So I think on one end of the spectrum, you have a concept of really high volume and a relatively higher volume of low intensity or lower intensity, so everything's relative, lower intensity repetitions. Okay, this is traditionally, as I'm redefining terms in swimming, just called high volume. But I actually think it's what really distinguishes it is a feature of the training that has, relative to other types of training, a higher volume of lower intensity repetitions. And on the other end of the spectrum, you actually also have a focus on high volume. But we're not talking about total volume here. So on the other end of the spectrum, you have a focus on a higher volume of higher intensity repetitions. Okay, USRPT is a great example of a program that emphasizes, okay, high volume relative to other training modalities of higher repetitions. And the reason, but so typically in the swimming world, this gets referred to as low volume. And I kind of disagree with that. I think everybody's aiming to push volume, right? It's just what intensity level are they trying to maximize the volume on? And that's going to be kind of important to understanding some of the features that each sort of end of this spectrum and training modalities create. And I think I should pause, by the way, at this point, just to let everybody know. You probably can already tell from the way I'm talking about this. I'm not a scientist by a long shot. I would say my non-swimming specific area of expertise is positive psychology. I know how to read an academic study and draw my own conclusions from it, but I am not an expert in biology. I'm not an expert in exercise physiology. I have a very superficial level of knowledge in these topics. So some of the ways I'm going to be talking about this, you might think like, that's not exactly how it works. Take these as my qualitative observations from years of coaching swimming and talking with other people that coach swimming, right? So they're not quantitative. I'm not going to be citing any studies or talking to you about how a randomized trial showed that this type of training creates this effect. I'm simply going to be sharing with you my experiences, my qualitative observations of what I've seen. Okay, so moving on and getting into the features of some of the both ends of the spectrum in training. So when we look at higher volume of lower intensity work, one of the features that I think is really important in this is that you just get more reps. You get more repetitions, I should say, especially for learning new skills. So just by virtue of having a practice with a higher overall volume, you're just like, let's say you swam a 10,000 yard swim practice, okay? Your arm is going to recover in freestyle and pull in freestyle many, many, many more times than if you swam a 3,000 yard swim practice at super high intensity. You will just get more repetitions. And this is actually really important, in my opinion, for skill acquisition, especially new skills. I think, one of the things that doesn't pass the honesty test when you look at sort of strictly interpreted USRPT is how little attention is given to new skill acquisition, because there's so much focus on doing things at race level intensity. But if you think about, whenever you're trying to learn something new, it's pretty universal that you must do it slowly first, or um, you're not going to be, first off, it's probably not going to be safe. And second off, it's going to take you longer to learn if you try to do it really fast. Okay, so we don't take brand new drivers that are learning to drive and put them out on a racetrack and go, I want you to do a 3-point turn with your pedal to the metal the entire time, right? We practice these things super duper duper slow first. If you're in school and you're learning like my daughter's learning multiplication for the first time, they don't do a lot of multiplication problems in a given day. They practice it pretty slowly, and they slowly build up to doing more and more of it, and of course more challenging versions of it. So that's one big feature. I would say one of the benefits of higher volume, lower intensity work that I didn't really understand, and now I understand that I'm a year in, is that the skills that people practice due to this sort of higher, I think, now here's where I go, all scientist by myself, but I posit that the higher amount of reps at lower intensity make a lot of the skills that swimmers have more repeatable in a meet setting. So I'll give you like a little more specific example. So when I was coaching swimmers at a super high intensity level, so we were really focused on higher volume of high intensity work, I could get kids to that were swimming that I coached, I could get them to practice at a really high skill level to where I would get really, really excited about how they were going to do in a meet setting. But I would often notice that their ability to replicate it in a meet setting was highly unstable. So you'd have that kind of effect, and I think many swim coaches know what I'm talking about, where you go like, oh man, Beatrice's fly is looking so good. I can't wait to see it in the meet. She's just practicing amazing. And then you watch her swim in the meet and you go, that doesn't look anything like what I've seen in practice, right? And it's frustrating for the swimmer. It's frustrating for you. I have noticed that as I coach a higher volume of lower intensity reps, that doesn't really happen. Okay, I don't see that inconsistency between the skill level that they're practicing at and the skill level that they are performing at. And I'm trying to say this without judgment, because I do think it's possible that you're putting a sort of lower ceiling on their sort of peak skill development, and this will be a theme throughout what I'm talking. So there's definitely a bit of trade-off in that respect, but that inconsistency, I can't deny that from my eye, that inconsistency is gone. And maybe there's another reason for that. If you know how to sort that out, feel free to comment, write me, be kind, in the way that you do it, and we'll have a great conversation. Another feature of higher volume, low intensity work that I have noticed is, and this sort of goes hand in hand with the next feature I'm going to say, is that swimmers tend to have a greater ability to swim at their peak level of performance more times in a session/meet. So if you think about, like I just had a meet with swimmers. They had a session that was about 3 hours from start to finish. Okay, and I had them swimming 3 times over the course of that. I could have probably had them swim 4 times. I guess I could have had them swim 2 times. I wouldn't advise that. But 3 or 4 times, right? And one of the things I've noticed is that their ability to replicate sort of peak performance over a session like that is improved with a higher volume of low intensity work relative to when I would coach swimmers. I could notice that they would maybe swim really, really fast in their first race if I had them at higher volume of high intensity work, and that there would be sort of a gradual waning of that even over the course of a session, but definitely over the course of a meet. And a lot of us get into situations where there's maybe a 3-4 day meet. Olympic trials is an 8-day meet, so when you get up to the higher levels, the meets get longer, okay? And so in many cases, this ability to replicate becomes more and more important. And I said this works hand in hand with the next thing is I do believe that if you train higher volume of low intensity work, okay, you may, again, lower the ceiling of what a swimmer's top end speed might be. And relative to a higher volume of high intensity training. So what this means in essence, and I think it works, the reason why I think it's related to the next one is because they're engaging perhaps less of their sort of full speed potential, it's easier to replicate over multiple races over the course. And again, these are all simplifications and generalizations. I'm not saying that you can't sprint really fast if you train a higher volume of low intensity work. What I am saying is relative to, if we make the sort of apples to apples comparison here, the one of the advantages that this sort of that higher volume of high intensity work can create is that you can reach a higher top end speed, okay? And so I want to get into higher volume, high intensity work, what I see as some of the features. So the first one right off the bat goes hand in hand with what we've been talking about, is that I think you can just create a higher level of peak performance. And I've talked about this on other podcasts. This is a really interesting feature of performance. I think whatever kind of training you've done, one of the ways that I think swimmers and coaches tend to oversimplify the level of training that they've done is they tend to think of it like very linear. Like I've done, they do a block of training, then they go to a meet and they get a time and they think this block of training led to this time. Okay. And that's pretty natural, right? To think that linearly. But what I always think of is whatever kind of training effect you've done, you've created a range of performance. And by the way, I have to give a shout out to to Dirk Reinecke, a coach in Switzerland, because he was the first one who really sort of explained this concept to me. We were coaching a swimmer together. I had a swimmer that was at Georgia Tech, but Dirk was his club coach back in Switzerland. And, he would talk about how the swimmer had a really good swim prior to starting at Georgia Tech. And he said, but this was the highest end of the range of performance, in his opinion, that the swimmer had trained for. So, in essence, we could create a different range with a better training effect, and yet he might not have the swim of his life, right? An absolute peak performance. And so even though the training was better, the performance could be slower. This is really important, I think, for a lot of people to realize, because they make this linear connection and it makes them retroactively doubt their training. They go, well, if the training I did over this time period led to me getting slower, therefore the training must not be good. Well, that's not necessarily the case. It could easily be the case that the training that you did was actually better, but you didn't have as good a performance on meet day, for any number of reasons, right? There's all these things that are a little bit volatile around a competition, that can lead to for you to either be at the top of your performance range that you've created through training or at the bottom, right? So it's really important to assess those factors as well. So in any sense, I think that you can basically with higher volume, high intensity work, I think you can actually make the peak of your range bigger. But I also think that you probably make your range bigger, right? So if the higher volume of low intensity window looks like this, right? You might be able to create a higher peak with high intensity work, but the ceiling is probably also going to be lower. So that's what creates, in my opinion, some of this volatility between the two things. One of the features, I guess this is, I'm trying not to be judgmental, but I do think in many cases, higher volume of high intensity work can lead to over specification. Because if you start going down some of this rabbit hole, especially with USRPT, you can think like, okay, well, it's really important, training must be specific, so let's just train for some specific races. I'm not saying everybody does this. I think there's plenty of people out there that are training higher volume, high intensity work that are still trying to keep the people they're coaching from over specifying. But I think it's in many ways more prone to over specification, to the sort of focusing on a very limited event set. And that's like kind of like this is like a throwaway comment in this video, but I actually, probably one of these I'm going to do in the future is going to be all about specification. Not the biological aspects of it, but actually I think really the key feature of specification that I feel more and more every year is the psychological impact of it. How hard specification or specializing can make the sport of swimming. If I go on to the next feature, I think again, sort of there's a theme that you're probably sensing here. I think you have more volatility over the course of a session or a meet in swimming. So you might have some really high end sort of peak performances. You're more likely also to have some inconsistency, some low end peak performances in the course of a meet on lower volume training. And again, I think that's because of the expanded window of performance created by the training. And then I think, and I referenced this sort of, I'm repeating myself already, but I think you can create a better peak skill level, but it's less replicatable. And part of this is the reason, again, if I return all the way to the beginning, is because when you train a higher volume of high intensity work, you still end up with less total repetitions, right? Because the higher volume of high intensity work, you simply can't replicate the total number of repetitions that higher volume, low intensity work can. So you're going to end up with less replications. You're going to end up with stuff that's in some ways less ingrained, less in that muscle memory, less, just overall less repeatable. So you're going to have to deal with some of that volatility. Okay. The final thing I want to add, now that I've sort of gone through some of the, what I think are the most important features of these two, is I want to talk about the strokes, because there's some interesting idiosyncrasies when you look at the strokes. And again, I'm speaking in broad brushes here, so I'm actually still, I could get into each of the four strokes individually. You could talk about IM as its own. But for the purposes of this, I just want to talk about some of the key differences I see between freestyle and backstroke, and then breaststroke and butterfly. So the long axis strokes, we call them, because you're rotating along the longest part of your body, right? And the short axis strokes, because you're moving on primarily on the short the narrow part of your body, right? And because it has implications for the type of training that you do and sort of what's effective. I think that my experience, again, not a scientist, I don't have any hard data to back this up, but I believe that both backstroke and freestyle respond better than breaststroke and butterfly to higher volumes of low intensity work. Now, why is that? Here's my theory, okay? It has to do, in my opinion, with the strength required to swim with racing form. I think that at lower intensities, in freestyle and backstroke, you can come pretty close to replicating racing form with significantly less sort of strength recruitment. So you don't need to get up to a really high strength recruitment if you're a trained swimmer. We won't even get into that whole topic. But if you're a trained swimmer, you don't have to get into the same sort of strength recruitment zone to swim freestyle and backstroke at a low intensity level, and that low intensity level can still be pretty comparable to your racing speed. So, for example, like let's say you go 55 and 100 free, okay, somewhere between 110 or 115, there's a highly repeatable, fairly low intensity work zone for you to train in, right? And I think backstroke is very similar in that regard. They're not perfectly the same, and as I said, I'm not going to get into the specific differences, but essentially you can replicate something at a low intensity that is pretty close to them, and therefore you have more latitude, I think, for creating a training effect with higher volumes of low intensity work. Breaststroke and butterfly, okay, I think in order to swim them relatively fast or swim them in a way that offers you a training effect and something that is relatable to what you're going to do in a race, you have to use a lot of strength. Just look at the bodies of people who specialize in breaststroke, for instance. You're going to find a lot of people who look very strong. You're going to find you're more likely to find shorter swimmers because it's sort of the one stroke where where height, the relative advantage of height is diminished because if you can be really sort of strong for your size, that is a big advantage in breaststroke. Okay, so the lower intensity work, I think, is less sort of relatable in breaststroke and butterfly. Now, that doesn't mean that you should not do any low intensity work. Remember, if we came all the way back to the beginning, like we talk about, you need low intensity work to acquire new skills. So there's definitely still a role to be played with breaststroke and butterfly in terms of skill acquisition. But in terms of training, in my opinion, I still think that butterfly and breaststroke, it's about how much volume of high intensity you can create with both of them, right? And everybody can be a little bit creative about how exactly they're going to do it. And I guess I'll close with this. I say ultimately these generalities, these are generalities. And as a coach, you have training that you're trying to make functional and create a training effect for every athlete that comes to your practice. So if you have athletes that are consistently doing the work that you say 20 100s on 115, and they're completing all 20. They're pushing off the wall, they're finishing at the wall, they're swimming the proper stroke in between, they have some level of attention to how they're doing it. Then you have an opportunity to make small individualizations that don't change the core principles of the training. You don't have to give them a completely different set to do, but you're going to have athletes that are going to respond because of the wonderful variety of human beings. They're going to respond in different ways to different volumes of different intensities, right? And, you know, you have the opportunity. I think what makes, you know, a good coach in terms of training, what differentiates you from an average coach or even a bad coach is not necessarily writing 8 different workouts, but how can you make the same sort of core workout really functional, really helpful to every single athlete that's in there, or as many athletes as possible. All right, everybody. Hey, I hope you enjoyed this conversation. I hope you learned something from doing it. I hope that you're all having a good day. I'll probably be back next week with a guest. We'll be back later in the week with Eric and Joel to talk all things news. Appreciate you all for listening. And head on over to YouTube and watch some of these videos. Leave a comment for the algorithm. Like, subscribe, do all that stuff. And I'll catch you soon.